were the private property of their parents. "Thou shalt not kill" was attributed to the belief of the dominant class that their bodies were private property and therefore they should be protected, along with other property rights. "Thou shalt not commit adultery" and "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife" were said to have been created to implement the idea that a husband was the master of the home and the wife was strictly private property belonging to him. This last line of reasoning led to some catastrophic consequences when the Communists came into power in Russia. In their anxiety to make women equal with men and prevent them from becoming private property, they degraded womankind to the lowest and most primitive level. Some communist leaders advocated complete libertinism and promiscuity to replace marriage and the family. Excerpts from a decree issued in the Soviet of Saralov will illustrate the point. Beginning with March 1, 1919, the right to possess women between the ages of 17 and 32 is abolished. This decree, however, not being applicable to women who have 5 children, by virtue of the present decree, no woman can any longer be considered as private property, and all women become the property of the nation. The distribution and maintenance of nationalized women, in conformity with the decision of responsible organizations, are the prerogative of the group of Saralov anarchists. All women thus put at the disposition of the nation must, within 3 days after the publication of the present decree, present themselves in person at the address indicated and provide all necessary information. Any man who wishes to make use of a nationalized woman must hold a certificate issued by the Administrative Council of a professional union or by the Soviet of Workers, Soldiers, or Peasants, attesting that he belongs to the working class. Every worker is required to turn in 2% of his salary to the fund. Male citizens not belonging to the working class may enjoy the same rights, provided they pay a sum equivalent to 250 French francs, which will be turned over to the public fund. Any women who by virtue of the present decree will be declared national property will receive from the public fund a salary equivalent to 575 French francs a month. Any pregnant woman will be dispensed of her duties for 4 months before and 3 months after the birth of the child. 1 month after birth, children will be placed in an institution entrusted with their care and education. They will remain there to complete their instruction and education at the expense of the National Fund until they reach the age of 17. All those who refuse to recognize the present decree and to cooperate with the authorities shall be declared enemies of the people, anti-anarchists, and shall suffer the consequences. Another document which illustrates the kind of liberation which women received under the communist version of morality is contained in a decision handed down by a Soviet official in whom he said, "There is no such thing as a woman being violated by a man. He who says that a violation is wrong denies the October Communist Revolution. To defend a violated woman is to reveal oneself as a bourgeois and a partisan of private property." Only one other thought need be added concerning the communist allegation that Judaic Christian morals represent a class morality. That is the fact that not only is it quite simple to illustrate that such an allegation is untrue, but it is also quite simple to illustrate that the most perfect example of class morality on the face of the earth today is communism. Of the 180 million people in Russia, only about 3 million are members of the Communist Party. This small ruling minority ruthlessly compels the remainder of the people to accept its decision as to what is good and what is bad. Communist morals follow a simple formula. Anything which promotes the communist cause is good. Anything which hinders it is bad. Upon examination, that philosophy turns out to be a code of opportunism and expediency, or a code of no morals at all. Anyone who does not conform to the dictates of the party as to what is good for communism and what is not is subjected to the most severe penalties under Articles 131 and 133 of the Soviet Constitution. Thus, the perfect example of class morality, which the Marxists attribute to the Judaic Christian Code, is to be found right in the Communist Plan of Action itself. The Communist Theory of Class Struggle. Fallacy 9. The next fallacy is the claim of Marx and Engels that they had discovered the secret of human progress. This was identified by them as class struggle. As the student will recall, they said that when men became aware that slavery was a satisfactory mode of production, they built a society designed to protect the rights of the slave owner. They further believed that if this state of affairs had never been challenged, the mode of production by slavery would have become a permanent fixture, and society likewise would have been fixed. But Marx and Engels found, as do all students of history, that the economic order passed from slavery to feudalism, and then from feudalism to capitalism. What caused this? They decided it was class struggle. They decided the slaves overthrew their masters and created a new mode of production based on feudalism. A society was then developed to protect this mode of production until the serfs overthrew their lords and set up a mode of production characterized by free enterprise capitalism. Modern society, they said, is to protect capitalism. Critics declare that Marx and Engels apparently ignored some of the most obvious facts of history. For example, the decay and overthrow of ancient civilizations such as Egypt, Greece, and Rome had nothing to do with slaves rising up against their masters. The slaves of those days were for the most part subservient, abject, and helpless creatures whose occasional murmurings and rebellions were suppressed with horrible cruelty. Those were not class struggles of the imaginary Marxian type, and did not bring the transition to feudalism. Engels himself says that toward the end of the Roman Empire slaves were scarce and dear, that the latifundia, which were great agricultural estates based on slave labor, were no longer profitable, that small-scale farming by colonists and tenants was relatively lucrative, and that, in short, slavery died because it did not pay any longer. Then came the barbarian invasion, the downfall of Rome, and the establishment of feudalism as the result of the conquest of a higher civilization by a lower, and not through the alleged driving force of a class struggle. Similar historical problems exist for Marx and Engels in connection with the transition of society from feudalism to capitalism. Fallacy 10. Not only does communism fail in its attempt to account for past progress on the basis of class struggle, but it also fails in its prediction that class antagonism would increase under capitalism in the future. Over 100 years have failed to develop the two violently antagonistic classes which Marx and Engels said were inevitable. Communist agitators have done everything in their power to fan the flame of artificial class consciousness in the minds of the workers, but the basic struggle between labor and capital has not been to overthrow capitalism, but to get the workers a more equitable share of the fruits of capitalism. For example, during the past 20 years, labor has attained a higher status in the United States than ever before. The communists tried to seize leadership in this reform trend, but the more the workers earned, the more independent they became, not only by asserting their rights in relation to their employers, but also in discharging the communist agitators from labor union leadership. Workers did not respond to the communist call to overthrow capitalism, and communist writers have admitted this with some bitterness. At the same time, both governmental and industrial leaders generally developed the philosophy that strong buying power in labor is essential to keep the wheels of industry moving. Labor, therefore, came closer to assuming its proper role as an integral part of capitalism than ever before. This trend leaves communism completely undone, because such a development makes labor an indispensable part of capitalism rather than its class-conscious enemy. Fallacy 11. Another communist premise which has failed is the assumption that under capitalism all wealth would be gradually monopolized until a handful of men would own everything, and the exploited, propertyless class would be the overwhelming majority of mankind. Instead of growing, however, the propertyless proletariats actually have been decreasing under capitalism. Marx wrote his massive tome on capital while he was living in the most abject poverty. He looked upon the proletariat as those who were living under conditions similar to his own, people who had absolutely no property and no capital interests. Today, in the highly developed capitalistic nation of the United States, the only people who could be classed as proletariat under Marx's definition would be those who own no land, have no savings deposits, no social security, no retirement benefits, no life insurance, no corporate securities, and no government bonds, for all these represent the ownership of